welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl, and it's really good to have you with us. This week we're exploring the story of the Transfiguration, told from the point of view of Luke, as we get ourselves ready to begin the upcoming season of Lent. But before we dive into today's passage, if you haven't done so already, you may find it useful to download the sheet that accompanies this Bible study. You can find the link to that in the video description in YouTube. On the sheet you will find the text of today's reading, some other passages you may find it helpful to consult, the questions we'll be considering later on, and lots of space for you to record your own thoughts and observation. So without further ado, let's dive into today's passage, which comes from Luke's Gospel, chapter 9, verses 28 to 36. Jesus had been followed around and tracked down by huge crowds of people as he wandered around the region of Galilee. He'd been trying to have some time regrouping quietly with his disciples who he'd sent out on their first sort of missionary endeavour, if you will, and who had just come back to him. And he found himself, instead of having that private time, feeding at least 5,000 people in an open space near Bethsaida, as we hear about in verses 10 to 17 of chapter 9. And when he and his disciples did get the chance to pray privately, Jesus asked them about who these crowds understood him to be. You see in verses 18 to 20. After various options were put forward, Peter hits the nail on the head by referring to Jesus as the Messiah. He's the first one to do so out of all of the disciples. But following on from that, Jesus explains what that means. He says that means that the Son of Man, his favourite title for himself, would have to suffer and to die before rising again 3 days later. And that being his disciple, being a follower, would mean self-denial, taking up the cross and following in his footsteps. In other words, entering into that dynamic of death and resurrection. So that gives us the backdrop to the account of the Transfiguration in Luke. And the events of today's passage occur 8 days after Jesus' teaching about what being the Messiah meant. And the mountain in question, some believe to be Mount Hermon and others believe to be Mount Tabor. That comes in verse 28, and we might also consult the equivalents in Mark and Matthew to get a further sense of location. So in this passage we have obviously Jesus at very much the turning point of his public ministry. This is the pivot point when the action will begin to shift away from Galilee and towards Jerusalem, where he was now headed. We have Jesus' three closest friends, Peter, James and John. It is they who have seen Jairus' daughter raised from the dead, and they're now going to see the miraculous Transfiguration. And note that Peter, James and John, as we learnt in chapter 5 verses 1 to 11, were the first 3 disciples to be called by Jesus in another episode which quite possibly looks ahead to the resurrection with an abundant catch of fish. We also have a couple of key figures from the Hebrew scriptures. We firstly have Moses, who was the great liberator and giver of the law to the people of Israel, whose burial place, we learn in Deuteronomy chapter 34 verse 6, was unknown. And we also have Elijah, who was the greatest of the prophets, who didn't die, we're told, but was carried off into heaven on a fiery chariot. Now Luke's Gospel was the third to be written around the 80 to 85 mark of the Common Era, and we know that Mark's Gospel was first and Matthew's was second. Mark and Matthew each contain their own accounts of the Transfiguration in Mark chapter 9 verses 2 to 9 and Matthew 17 verses 1 to 8. And Luke's is the third and final account, because there isn't one in John's Gospel, of the Transfiguration. It's also referred to in 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 18. There's some dispute about the authorship of 2 Peter, whether it was the Peter of the Gospels or somebody writing in his name. But the connection to the Transfiguration and Peter's specific role in this has led people to argue for Peter's authorship of 2 Peter. So we've got this really powerful narrative of the Transfiguration, drawing on lots of symbolism from the Hebrew Scriptures. And so we might wish to take a look also at Exodus chapter 34, verses 29 to 35, which has Moses descending from Mount Sinai and his face being dazzling white after his encounter with God and his reception of the law, forming of a new covenant. And we might also wish to look at 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 to 12, or maybe just focusing on verses 9 to 12. That gives us the story of Elijah and his kind of handing over of the mantle to Elisha as he was carted off in that fiery chariot up to heaven. The Transfiguration, as Luke narrates it, sets out for us the purpose of following Jesus and a sense of where it leads if we are disciples, foreshadowing, as one commentator put it, the glory of resurrection in a context of passion prediction and discipleship teaching. So it really is an important pivot point, and that's actually why we look at it before we move into the story of Lent. Now for Luke, the Transfiguration took place 8 days, as I noted earlier, after the messianic teachings. We learned that in the first part of verse 28. And that compares to the 6 days we find in Mark chapter 9 verse 2 and Matthew 17 verse 1. It could be that Luke is wanting to point us to the symbol of circumcision. Jewish boys were circumcised on their 8th day. So it may be there's something about covenant that Luke is wanting to get in by this change of date. But it doesn't seem to be that significant a detail in the overall narrative. Nor was the place of encounter necessarily a specific place of encounter for Luke. We know that mountains were traditionally places where people would encounter God, and Jesus had gone up some unknown mountain to pray. His doing that might remind us of, say, Exodus 19, verses 16 to 19, or chapter 20, verses 1 to 17, or we might think about 1 Kings 19, verses 11 to 13, for example, to get another snapshot of Elijah. But Luke doesn't seem too bothered about the exact location. It's just the mountain symbolism and that place of openness to God that seems to matter to Luke. Now in verse 29, we're told that when Jesus was praying, his face, as the Greek puts it, became other, became heteros, the same word used in Matthew 17, verse 2. And his clothes, we're told, became dazzling white. And that might remind us of the scene with the empty tomb and the mysterious figures there in chapter 24, verse 4. And it also might remind us of our reading from Exodus 34 and what we learn about Moses and his dazzling white face and clothes. Now, Luke does not use the word metamorphosis, translated as transfiguration, and therefore doesn't explicitly say, in the same way that Mark and Matthew do, that Jesus was transfigured. And the argument many commentators use is that perhaps he was trying to avoid comparison with Greek myths that portrayed their godlike figures in that way. That would make sense as an explanation, given we know Luke was writing for a predominantly Gentile audience. Now when we look at verse 30 and the fact that Jesus appears to be in conversation with Moses, so the lawgiver, and Elijah, the greatest of the prophets, it has been argued that these two figures are there in this miraculous scene because of their representative role, and that it's talking about Jesus bringing the Israelite tradition to its fulfillment and then taking it into its next chapter, if I could put it like that. And it's interesting that both Moses and Elijah are figures that were thought would reappear with the coming of the Messiah. So we see that with Moses in Deuteronomy 18 verse 15, and in Malachi chapter 4 verse 5 with Elijah, for example. But it's not the only way to understand the significance of Moses and Elijah being Jesus' conversation partners. Another view is that his departure, that it speaks of in verse 31, literally in the Greek Exodus, and its fulfillment in Jerusalem that we hear about, is a pointer towards death and resurrection, making that connection back to verse 22 of chapter 9 and Jesus' messianic prediction. It's fascinating that Luke's Gospel is the only one of the three synoptics that have an account of the Transfiguration to give us a flavour of what was said. And even then we don't get the specifics of the conversation. I think regardless of whether we're talking about Jesus as the fulfilment of Israel's tradition or it's a really powerful look ahead to death and resurrection, what we do get is a really strong affirmation of Jesus as Messiah. And we know that, as he's already indicated, this path is going to take him to Jerusalem, and not to being the all-conquering military Messiah some hoped for, but to, as Jesus has already indicated, his death on the cross before rising again. It's interesting in verse 32 that we're told that Peter, James and John were kind of sleepy. They were weighed down with sleep. But nonetheless, because they were able to stay awake, we're told, in the end part of verse 32, they saw his glory. Now it's interesting that the Hebrew word for glory is kavod, and it means weighty, it means having gravitas, if I could put it like that. So it's kind of like there's a pun here, there's the heaviness of the disciples' sleep set against the gravitas of divine glory. Peter, it seems, wanted to prolong the moment, having witnessed the glory of God in this scene. And so he suggests building 3 booths or tents or tabernacles, depending on your translation. One for Jesus, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. That suggestion takes us to the Jewish festival of tabernacles and its relationship to thinking about God's wilderness protection. So it links us with Leviticus chapter 23 verses 39 to 43. Peter, we're told, didn't know what he was saying, and other Gospels remind us how frightened he was. And it seems that he wanted to kind of remain in that holy place, that set apartness, that supernatural scene, if I could put it like that, with Jesus and Moses and Elijah for longer. But it wasn't to be, because we're told in verse 34 that this cloud descends upon them, that cloud echoing the cloud that signified the presence of God as Israel wandered in the wilderness, symbolising the Shekinah, as we see in Exodus 13 verse 21, for example. And the overshadowing that it talks about uses the same word as we find in the story of Mary in chapter 1 verse 35, where the Holy Spirit overshadows her when she learns she's going to be the mother of the Son of God. So there's very much a sense of being swept up here into the heart of God with this descent of this cloud. And the voice from the cloud, as opposed to the voice of heaven in Jesus' baptism, we find in chapter 3 verses 21 and 22, is this time audible to the disciples. They can hear what's being said. This is my beloved, my chosen, my son. And it echoes the really powerful and quite scary theophany of Exodus chapters 19 and 20. And finally, when we come to verse 36, we learn that unlike in Mark and Matthew's versions, Luke has Peter, James and John deciding to keep quiet until after Jesus' death and resurrection, rather than being explicitly sworn to secrecy. They themselves here make that decision. So it's a really powerful passage. There's an awful lot one could draw out if one was preaching on this text, not least some of the subtle differences between Mark and Matthew's accounts and Luke's, and what that tells us about Luke's particular emphasis. And we're going to explore some of the various themes that emerge now in our questions.